these 3 or 4 reference points. There's one Bansali reference point, there's a Karan Johar reference point, there's an Anurag Kashyap reference point. There's like 4 sort of adjectives you can use on any project. And then if you're like sort of in between something and there's no language for your work yet, then you get sort of described in relation to other work.
So, hi Ashim, welcome to Ketchup Talks,
Hi,
Social Ketchup.
thank you.
First of all, it's like really an honor to have you here. Um, I absolutely loved watching Class, and I have seen Elite too. So it's beyond for me to have you here and talk to you. Um,
Thank you so much.
yeah. So my first question is actually, did you anticipate this much of polarization reviews? Because Class has been going successfully well. I mean, it's almost 2 months and it has been doing very successfully well on Netflix. And I was going through a lot of reviews I went through earlier as well. And while there were people who said that it's just a copy of Elite, who had seen Elite, there were also people who were refuting them and saying, no, it's much more. You have to really see it. So, did you actually felt that, or did you anticipate that there would be such a vast polarization that would be coming in from the audience?
Yeah, I mean, I think all my work is always polarized. Like everything I've made is always polarized audiences. Like I don't have a middle ground audience somehow. It's strange. My work always is like either you love it or you hate it. It's just not in the middle. Um, and I actually don't mind that. I don't mind that because I think that that means the work finds its audience actually. And also what happens, with shows and with anything, with films, I think audiences change their relationship to the work over time. So, for example, when the first trailer dropped, there was all this, oh, Sasta Elite, India can't make it. Why would we make it? All this stuff, which I thought was quite funny because I was obviously anticipating that. But what was interesting is the minute the show dropped, that stuff just evaporated, and suddenly it was like, okay, this is not really elite, but and then it went into some other kind of thing. Then there was, of course, conversations about, oh, it's not realistic, or oh, there are too many topics covered, or whatever, which frankly, I mean, it's one of those things, it's a very strong show. It has a very strong point of view. It's not a wishy-washy TV program that is just like neither here nor there. It takes a stand. It's very particular in its aesthetics. So that people will respond. It's also very new. Honestly speaking, it's very new. So I also think our audience hasn't seen anything like that. There is also that what I call teething time, a little bit, where at first it's like, oh my God, and then on second round it's a little bit like, actually it's not so bad, and then it's like, oh, I actually really like it. So I think sometimes these reactions have to take their time.
Yeah, because actually, I went through a lot of reviews, and there was somebody who mentioned Delhi wala point, and I was going through your interviews as well. So you have
Mm.
mentioned why you chose Delhi as a specific point, and it was lovely to see that audience could also get at the geographical point of Delhi and why you chose Delhi. It was amazing
Yeah.
that people even could see that.
Yeah. The conversations actually around this show are amazing. Like, I feel like, from the time I made my first film, Miss Lovely, which was, of course, a very art house and very outside the box film, and I saw the conversations there, which were very basic, to now, I feel the audience has really evolved. Like, I think there's a conversation the level of sort of discourse is much higher. It's not just, of course, you have the sasta elite and, oh, why rich people don't do this. But I kind of dismiss that as not real conversation. Like real conversation is, why is the caste angle like this? Or why is the queer love shown like that? Or whatever, like where there's actually nuanced conversation. And I think there's a lot of that. So I take that, even if it's critical or whatever, I take that as a huge compliment if work can generate that kind of conversation.
Yeah, and it's actually happening with Elite a lot. I mean, there are people who are also calling it Karan Johar's ka Student of the Year.
Which is weird because it's actually very far from that. If you see that, I almost feel like sometimes people don't watch it and they already have a point of view, because I can't imagine anybody watching 8 episodes of that and thinking it's like Student of the Year. That would be
I think
insane.
I feel why that has come out because I mentioned this in my review also, because people are not used to seeing such food. So their only representation on screen was probably Student of the Year.
Yeah, and I
And
think that's a really good point. I think that it's something that in the beginning used to really upset me with my first film. It would be like, Why am I being compared to directors that I have no relationship to, or I don't even engage with their work? And then I realized, wait, it has nothing to do with me. It actually has to do with the audience having these 3 or 4 reference points. There's one Bansali reference point, there's a Karan Johar reference point, there's an Anurag Kashyap reference point. There's like 4 sort of adjectives you can use on any project. And then if you're like sort of in between something and there's no language for your work yet, then you get sort of described in relation to other work. But I actually think that this doesn't have a language yet, this show. I mean, it needs a new language for this conversation, you know?
I'm very interested what you're going to do in season two because I've seen Elite, and in season two, I think because of the actors going to Money Heist or something, whatever the politics happened there, the 2 actors had to be killed off or something. But I'm very interested what you're
Yeah,
going to do and how the story is going to go forward because you've kept the storyline is pretty much the same, but I like the nuances that
yes,
have.
I did. No, I'm actually not going to be involved with season two because I feel, I really have had my time with
Yeah.
this with the first season. I feel like I really did the best I could with the world that I had, and I think it's for now others to take it on. So I'm sure there's, I mean, of course, there's going to be season two, and I'm sure there's going to be many more seasons. But I think it'll be other storytellers or other makers that will take it in different directions. But for me, I think my um, for me, it ended at the end of season one for me as a storyline, and then of course it can go anywhere. And I think, of course, now it has its own life, so it doesn't need to stick to the plot of Elite. I think the whole idea was that it just builds its own universe out, and then those characters can actually have their own life. And I'm sure that's the way they'll take it forward. I don't think it'll have the same. It won't have the same plot point anymore. Now it'll have its own life.
But why did you chose to have the same plot line? With adaptations. That's a very crucial
Yeah,
question that comes whether you just want
yeah,
the core concept to be there or you want the entire
yeah,
plot line.
yeah. Yeah. So when I was approached to do the adaptation, I thought it was firstly when I had never seen Elite, and when I saw it, I thought, okay, this is really not my kind of thing in terms of the way it's made. But I find the material, like the writing, very interesting. I think this could be really relevant to India, especially the class divide and this rich versus poor. I immediately imagined it in Delhi. And I thought, what we have, which the Spanish don't have, we have so much more, conflict in a way in our society between in every way, And so I had a different take on it. I said, this is already running on a platform. We're making an adaptation. I don't want to try and make something new when it comes to the plot. I think what if we did something very different? We used it like the way you would adapt a Shakespeare or a Pride and Prejudice. You take it like a source novel, you know the outcome, you already know the plot, you know the characters, sort of who they are, and you have a map of the whole thing, and yet the telling is totally different, right? And we have that even with our epics, whether it's the Ramayana or whatever it is. Like, you know the outcome. It's every time you tell it, depending on where it's told. If it's told on TV vis-a-vis in a village in a mela, it's different. It has a totally different telling style. And then there are subplots and other atmospheres and other psychologies that come in. So for me, I was very clear that I want the plot to be identical. And I thought that was actually quite funny because I was like, in a way, there's an identical plot running on the same platform. You can watch it. And yet, at the same time, when you watch it, there is no way in hell that you can say the two shows are the same. They're entirely different because, and so for me, this criticism of why didn't you change the plot? Who cares if I change the murderer to someone else? I mean, it wouldn't have actually impacted, to me, it wouldn't have impacted the emotional landscape as much as if I added this atmosphere of Delhi and the psychology of these kids and the stuff that I really felt was important that was missing in the original, which was the parents. I felt the adults were not there. There was no social media in the first season at all. I think the relationship the kids had to social media, to narcotics, to all of that, that's completely new. So I think a lot of it was actually building up from assuming that I'm taking the plot as is. But what if this plot was real? What if this, which the original I felt was always, it had a bit of a telenovela style. It never felt like believable. And I said, what if I took this and put it in the real world and imagine the psychology of these characters to be absolutely real? I think it would be really interesting because it explained a lot of stuff that you never could understand in the original as to why people did what they did. So it was just a different approach. I just didn't really care to change the plot. I didn't think that was important enough. I thought the crux of it was the storytelling, the way it was told. So that was why.
Yeah, I think your approach also works because when you're watching the Spanish series or any other series that is beyond India, they have a benefit. Now we don't know their culture as much as we know ours. So I think involving your approach of Delhi and the lanes of Delhi specifically, I love the way you've shot Delhi in lane.
Mm.
It's very interesting. And then you see this rich side of things.
You
So
know, one of the things that was really interesting, just to add to that, is that there are subreddits of like the elite fandom, and that I was very interested. I actually don't care what lay people think about elite. What I do care about is the obsessive elite fans, right? I said, let me see what they're saying on worldwide, not just in India. What are they saying about this show? And I was really happy to see what was happening on the subreddits because they were all saying that class actually explains everything about elite. So, and there were comparisons, there were amazing subreddit comparisons between Guzman and Veer, and talking about why Guzman would never behave the way he did with Nadia, and why would Nadia ever be interested in Guzman? Because he was just an obnoxious guy. There was no softness to him. Whereas Veer explains the softness and the conflict in that character, which Guzman does not have. So I think it was very interesting, even the coming out, the way the two boys have to really struggle with their queerness, all of that. A lot of that was compared back to the original by elite fans, and actually a lot of them were like, this is really interesting because it explains so much about these characters in a different way. So I think it integrated with that fandom in a very interesting way. It didn't become like the poor man's copy, which is what I think a lot of people assumed it would be. In fact, I think a lot of people have compared it favorably to the original.
Yeah, for me also, Elite, I mean, I loved the first season. I was okay with the second season, but slowly it died down too. I mean, Elite, it happened with it. But yeah, of course, that was a very interesting approach. I mean, in fact, of knowing the entire story, I watched once first season. I was like, why would I watch the same thing? But then when I got
Exactly.
started to it, I just got hooked to it. So you can't
Exactly.
stop watching it after. Yeah. But
Exactly.
what was the most challenging part for you to shoot Class? What was that main
Uh,
point that was very challenging?
I think the whole thing was challenging to make because we made it during COVID. We made it during, three waves of COVID. Delta wave was really bad in Delhi, as you know. We were shooting in Delhi at that time. So it was really hard because on one hand, you have these kids hanging out in these spaces, which are all public spaces, like you're saying, the lanes of old Delhi and all that. But actually what you had was like thousands of people on the street with masks, shutdowns, city shutdowns. So you'd be waiting for 2 weeks to shoot. There would be gaps. So as a result, I lost a lot of crew because I had two DPs. I had a Spanish DP, a camerawoman, and I had a guy, Johan, who was Swedish, and they had other projects. So at some point they had to leave. So what would happen is that this was meant to be like a very quick shoot, and it just stretched out for 2.5 years, and then people would leave. So I had 5 different camera people. I had crew that was changing constantly, and actors were like going away for projects and coming back. And it was really to keep it all together and make it look consistent over all that time. Part of it is shot in Bombay, part of it is shot like the school is partly shot in the set. Some part is a set, some part is a location in Delhi, some part is a location in Bombay. So that was really hard. And when I watch it now, I mean, it's great because I can't tell what's shot where. And I made it. So I'm like, that is really a good. So that was really hard. That was really hard. It wasn't a very smooth production in that sense.
You mentioned the cast. There are such new faces. I was reading somewhere someone had written they all look like the AI versions of each other. I can't differentiate between all of them. They look
Mm.
so alike. But I was like, no. I mean, they do look same, but they do look different as well. And
Mm.
that was the entirety of the season. Also, were you going for that? That they do look somewhere similar, or they look apart from each other?
Not really. I don't think they look similar. I think they all, again, I think they just look different from what you're used to. I mean, I don't take too much of this criticism to heart because I'm like, okay, so what are you comparing it to? You're comparing it to films that are set in colleges with like 50-year-old Bollywood stars playing teenagers. Like that's the comparison. So I'm not hearing it. I'm saying, show me something that we have that is even remotely in this world, which is even comparable, and then let's have a conversation. Because I feel like a lot of the stuff that's compared, when we look at each other, like I don't think Chintan looks anything like Veer. I mean, I think that's an absurd statement because they just don't look alike. But yes, what they do look like is they don't look like your college students that you've seen on Z5 shows or on in Bollywood films. Like they don't look like those college students. They don't look like people you cast in standard, desi entertainment. They just don't look like that. So that in that way, yes, they are similar in that they're all unlike people that you see on screen.
Yeah.
You know, so I would say, yeah. I mean, there's a lot of this kind of stuff. You know, like comparisons with what? My question is, what are you comparing it to? You know, the
I think
stuff
for
that we're
my
so used to. Yeah.
probably for my generation it would be Kota Factory or all of the Dice Media or TVF shows that come to.
Yeah, and Kota Factory is in a very different environment. It's set in
Yeah,
a completely different milieu, you know. So we're talking about rich kids in Delhi. We're
yeah,
talking about a space that we've not really seen. I mean,
yeah,
we've seen Bollywood films of middle class people that live in like in palaces in London, and that's supposed to be a house in Delhi. You know, it's like
yeah.
so absurd that. And then when people say, "This is very unrealistic," I'm like, this is absolutely real. It's just a function of exposure. I think when you're exposed to Delhi's rich in any shape or form,
Mm.
you realize that this is actually kind of a subtle portrayal. Huh? It gets more extreme. This is not that over the top at all.
Oh, that's true because Delhi locker room case also happened, right? I mean, then when I was seeing Class, I could relate. I mean, those people are talking about that social media. They do have that group. It's a
I
reality
have
that
a
they
lot of
have.
questions. A lot of journalists have asked me, does this really happen? I'm like, just Google it. Just Google
Yeah, it does
boys'
happen.
locker room.
Yeah,
Google all the FMS scandals in Delhi. Like this is just it's it. Google all the kids that have run over somebody in their dad's Ferrari. Like it's all there. You
yeah.
know.
I was actually surprised that people are surprised that this really happens. I mean, it does. I mean, look at yourselves the way we're using Instagram and social media. It does happen. But
Yeah. Sometimes it's hard to watch yourself on screen. I think sometimes it's hard to reflect back.
yeah,
It's like you'd rather it be
yeah,
artificial. You don't want it to be too close.
that's true. That's true. But you mentioned Miss Lovely. Do you think if you would have made it today, it would have been different? The reception would have been different for that film today as
Yeah,
compared to
I
what it
think
would
I think I think Miss Lovely. I think even Daddy would have been different. I
have.
think
Yeah,
the environment has changed a lot. I think the audiences have changed. I think see the thing is that when I started making films, my first film was a film called John and Jane, and that was the first Indian film ever to be bought by HBO. The thing is that that was made in 2005 when I was just starting to make films, and it had to go to like Toronto and Berlin, and it had to do so much work to actually get out there. I could never get a release for it in India. It was never seen in. It was one of those things, right? And now when I look at like say Shaunak's film, like that's gone to the Oscar, and then this, for me, I'm like that's a huge shift. That there's even acknowledgement that there's any kind of work outside of the mainstream. I think what's happened is that the mainstream's collapsed. The Bollywood mainstream, as we knew it, which actually was when I was starting out, hugely dominating. Like I could not make anything. It was just this thing, this juggernaut on top of you, and like whatever you make is just invisible. That's changed. And I think because of obviously OTT and all of that and exposure, not just OTT, because it's not like the OTT content is that great. It's just that people have a window now to watch everything. Through Hotstar, they can watch HBO stuff, they can watch movie, they can watch world cinema, all of that. I think that just immediately changes the benchmarks of stuff. So yeah, I mean, I think it would have been a lot easier in some ways, but then also in a way, I think having to go through that process allows me now to make a class because I can be very confident with Netflix and say, no, I'm making this way. I am not changing it, and this is the vibe. And they somewhere say, this guy is really clear about his vision. Let's trust it and let's do that because I don't think younger directors would be able to get away with a lot of those things. So I think there's also the benefit of that.
but seeing Class also and seeing your previous works also, do you say that you could say that you have kind of politics as a filmmaker, or probably it's your ideology as a filmmaker? I read somewhere that you wrote explore the unexplored. Do you think
Yeah.
that is who you are as a filmmaker, and we'll see more of
Yeah.
that further ahead?
Yeah, I think that's what I'm interested in. That's probably why I don't want to do a season two. It's not that I don't love what I've made and I want to continue it, but I think as a filmmaker, it hampers my growth because I'm then doing the same thing again and again. And I think the whole point of me making a show that's about young kids in Delhi was because I did two films that were set in 80s Bombay. I wanted to do something completely different. So I always, whenever I make a piece of work, I will always say, okay, I'm done. I've explored this. Now I want to do something completely different. So yeah, I think definitely I'm excited about that, and I also think a lot of things that I started with which come from a very independent filmmaking sensibility, like using non-actors,
Hmm.
shooting in real spaces, lighting in a certain way, spending a lot of time on the atmosphere. That's very, I mean, if I say the hallmark of my work, it's very atmosphere. It's the world. You feel a world. You don't just feel faces in close up talking to each other. It's not just dialogue bazi. I'm not a dialogue bazi type filmmaker. I'm very like, you get into it, you know the house, you know the inside and outside of the school, you know, you feel those environments, like you're saying, the gullies or this or that or the khupchas, you feel it. And I think that's really come from my work. And I think the fact that I could bring in that into a mainstream platform like Netflix, where normally they don't really want to spend time on that, they want to go plot, 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 hook, drop, next episode, right? And the fact that we could build that and it could still be engaging, I think that's a huge testament, you know, to the fact that a lot of these things can be brought into bigger projects. They don't have to stay within the art house or independent realm. They can come into everyday, like all these kids were cast exactly the way I cast Nawaz from Miss Lovely. He was a random guy who was just struggling. He had never done a feature film. So it's very similar, the process here. And I think it works because look at the reception that these kids have got. It's because we've never seen them. Had they all been the kids of some Bollywood actors, and it would have been those nepo kids and all, you would have known what to expect. There would have been a certain kind of like this unsurprising quality to this, and I think this is a very, so for me, I feel very sort of, let's say, vindicated. It took a long time for audiences to say, okay, this is cool, we like it, and I think this has really worked in our favor in this case.
You think you've finally arrived now with class?
No, I think no, I think actually for me the biggest moment when I was felt acknowledgement was actually when I made my first film and it went to Toronto and Berlin. I mean, there was nothing because I was a random guy making something in Bombay, and that allowed me to finance Miss Lovely, which was financed internationally. And then, that in turn led to Arjun Rampal saying, hey, I love Miss Lovely, can we do something? And I'd never seen any Arjun Rampal film. And I was like, okay, let's do it. I'm totally not a Bollywood guy, but let's do it, And then, of course, class. So I think in terms of my relationship to younger audiences and just, and audiences in general, like understanding why a director does what they do, I think this project is very good in that sense. Like you can feel the director on the project. Like you understand, oh, there's this thing called direction. It's not just faces. It's not just actors or dialogue or lines. There's something other than that. That I think with class in a more mass way in India, I think that has happened. I think because otherwise I'm quite a outsider kind of filmmaker in that sense. I don't really play the game so much.
No, but what motivated you towards Miss Lovely?
I had actually wanted to make a documentary about these guys that were making C-grade sex horror films in the 80s. I was really interested in it. When I came back, I went to film school in the US. I came back to Bombay, and I didn't feel like I fit in obviously I didn't fit in Bollywood, and I didn't fit in the art house parallel cinema that was happening. I was like, I'm equally alienated from both, and then I saw this. I saw some posters for some sex horror films, which reminded me of stuff that I'd seen in school, and I was like, "Hey, these guys are still around. Like, should I just go talk to them and see whether there's a documentary?" So I spent a year actually hanging out with all these like really dodgy characters who were quite amazing, and went on sets and all that. And I wanted to make a documentary because they were all shooting illegal porn and stuff, and it was very interesting for me because they were doing it all under the radar, very cheap and all on film and all. This is like not on phones. This is like on 16 or 35 film. So I found this very fascinating. But then when the time came for me to film them, they all disappeared. They were like, no, 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 we are not saying all this on camera, not because we would go to jail for this. Then there was also like a lot of gangland money in it, and it was very sketchy. But what happened as a result is that I kind of became an expert on this space. They all became friends of mine. I spent a lot of time hanging out, getting drunk with these guys in shady bars, going to shoots, seeing how they shot the sex bits and all. I was like, I can't let this go. So I wrote that as a screenplay then. And to protect their identities, I kind of set it in the 80s because I was like, if I set it now, it's clear who's who. So I set it in the 80s, and that's how the project came about. And then I just made it like a fictional version of the same, but it's all real stuff.
Have you seen Cinema Marte Dam Tak?
Yeah, I was actually the creative consultant on that show. So they had asked me to kind of give them ideas and stuff initially. So I haven't seen it, but I've seen parts of it. And the actors, the directors like Jay Neelam and all the guys that are in it were some of the people that I had met when I was doing the Miss Lovely research. So that's how I I got involved with that.
I was reading that you're very interested in archival of, restoring the films also.
Yeah.
That is something you genuinely feel about.
Yeah, I'm really interested in restoring stuff that's also not considered important.
Mm,
Like I'm currently in the process of restoring some really hilarious and bizarre C grade films that I think are very important and that are like in very bad state in a very bad state. We won't have any of this history because nobody cares. Because basically these filmmakers are either too poor or they didn't care. I mean, forget about them. Even the big guys, they never felt the need to preserve anything. It was a very weird thing. So that means that, like, for example, now, if you want to get even a film print of an Amitabh Bachchan film, it's virtually impossible to get one. It's crazy. Like, I mean, you think that this guy was the biggest star for like 25 years straight, and you can't even get his films on 35 millimeter film. You can't even get the film. There's like some videotape with a producer somewhere. It's really sad. So I'm, a very close friend of mine, Shri Dungarpur, is doing this like full time as Film Heritage Foundation. They're doing all the big films and all that. But I'm actually interested in very personal stuff, like the random film that was made by, I don't know, some weird character somewhere or some artist somewhere. So I want to pick very specific films that I think are very important to Indian film history that are completely neglected, forgotten, whatever. And they could even be like a random failed Bollywood film. Could be a Mithun film that nobody watched or whatever. But these things that I think are really special that need to be preserved because if they go, we won't even know that they existed. And I think it's a as a filmmaker, like I learn from film history. I'm not watching new stuff. I'm watching stuff that's been made. That's where honestly half the stuff that you're seeing, it's kind of the filmmaker saw that thing which was something else before. So I think it's really important as a filmmaker, like just as a moral duty, you have to protect this stuff, and make sure it kind of survives.
With class, the other kind of criticism that came was it has too much sex, it involves in too much
Yeah.
sexual elements and everything. Do you think
Yeah.
C grade films and more knowledge on the C grade films will actually end up helping?
See, I think actually class does not have so much sex, considering, I mean, the Spanish one has a lot of nudity. I chose not to have any nudity whatsoever, and that was my choice. It wasn't even a choice on the platform. I just was like, I don't want it to be exploitation, where people are just looking at like nude scenes. So I really wanted it integrated into the storytelling. But I think that you can't make a film or a series about hormonal teenagers and not deal with sexual stuff. I mean, that's just ridiculous. Like it's absurd. So and you can't make stuff which is meant to be about people getting figuring their identities out and then not deal with sexuality because that's one of the key identities that you figure out when you're that age. So I find that criticism kind of silly. It's just childish in a way because I feel like it's the most basic thing, and I actually don't think there's that much sex in it. There is obviously sexuality in it and the exploration of sexuality in it, but I can think of like mainstream stuff or even stuff that's like on these platforms that's like super sleazy. That's just gratuitous sex all the time. There's Ulu and there's like even like what Awad Balaji was putting out was like crazy sexual.
That's
So
cringe.
yeah, and I'm saying that stuff that's done with no sensibility. It's just done only for male eyeballs. It's so desperately seeking audiences using sexuality that I find this criticism kind of quite basic because honestly, I think there's a lot more sexual content. Yeah, and I do think that sensitive sexual content, which is not always from this very hardcore male gaze where it's just like objectifying the female body. I think like just intelligent content that also deals with adult themes is definitely something that once we start seeing, and I'm hoping the class sort of opens that kind of stuff, that you just start seeing it. You don't make such a big deal out of it. You just sort of watch it and it's like, okay, this is part of life. It's not just, oh my God, it's sex, here's a red flag, it's crazy, whatever. You just get on with your life. Yeah, and you just watch it the way any adult mature society would watch it. It's just you watch it, it's part of the storyline, move on. I think what happens is this is coming from repression, no, like when a culture doesn't have access, when it's like, oh my God, it's bad. 1.2 billion people are clearly having sex in this country. You know what I mean? It's not that they don't know, it's just that they don't want to talk about it. So, and they're really freaked out by it or something, and therefore they're even more fascinated by it, and therefore they even more fetishize it. So I'm a big believer that if you have material out there, it reduces the amount of actual repression. It reduces violence against women, it reduces a lot of that kind of stuff. Yeah, like all this, or like eve teasing and getting like grabbed on buses and all this stuff will get significantly reduced if we just have like normal sexual mature material and people just get it out of their system, particularly men.
When you were talking about it, I would love to see you make kind of an adaptation of Sex Education. I don't know whether you have seen that series or not, but I would love
Right.
for you to actually make that.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. I mean, I think, yeah, there's room for lots of stuff.
are you interested in horror also?
Yeah, very much.
I would love to see a great horror film coming from you.
I am really interested in horror. I actually think we are like really starved for like lots of genre stuff. Like
Yeah.
we've not explored it, and I'll tell you why that is. That's basically because Bollywood, for the longest time, this Bollywood film was all genres in one film, right? So it was like there was action. The dude is like fighting, beating up people. He's like a cool guy, but then there's also romance, so he cries a little bit, and then there's then there's the family drama, so it becomes domestic drama, then there's the thriller element. So basically, what you have is one film that has like 8 genres in it, right? So as a result, we've never had genre cinema only. Like the horror stuff that we have, honestly, is Ramsey Brothers and C grade sex horror. That is the horror. Like the horror. I mean, there's been a few horror films that are like mainstream, but they're not really that great. And it's the same with anything. Like even comedy. Like you don't really have comedy. Like comedy was always part of the family drama, or there would be something else. Like it would be a shadi film, but there's comedy in it or
Hmm.
something. So we don't have genre films. Like it's crazy, but we make all this content and we basically don't have specific genres, and we don't have like horror directors that work in horror. We don't have people that just do action, or they do like rom-coms. Like it's a mishmash of this and
Hmm.
that. So I think that's a space which is hugely untapped. Yeah. Like I think we can really find amazing and Indian. So I did one horror short, which was part of an anthology, an international anthology called Field Guide to Evil. It was basically 8 directors doing folk horror stories from whichever country they came from. So 8 different countries, 8 different directors, and I did like a Bengali kind of folk tale kind of thing. So that was really fun. So I would love to explore more horror. I mean,
Can't wait to see what future holds you. Any projects that you can give hint to? What are your future projects?
so currently, I signed a project which I was meant to shoot with two female leads, kind of biggish stars, and it was a project that actually I wanted to make, which is based on a Danish novel. It's a crime novel, and it's. I mean, I think chick flick is a bad term, but I kind of think it sort of works in the way of like two very interesting characters who are polar opposites, just really kicking ass, and all the men in it are like villains, basically. So that's an interesting project. It's like a crime film set in Bombay, contemporary, and it's very real also and very interesting. So it's a project I'm working on, and I have a couple of international things which I've been really keen to make. Like one is set like in Italy in the 16th century, and it's a totally different thing from anything I've done. So I'm kind of sort of excited about that.
We
Yeah.
are as well. I'm really excited to see your work forward. Thank
That's
you
so
so
sweet.
much,
Thank
Ashim,
you.
for doing this.
Thanks a lot.